Hey readers and writers, I'm Adrian Buskey, and this is Fictitious, a show about the storytelling craft of science fiction and fantasy. I'm joined this episode by Marissa Levien, author of The World Gives Way. In this debut science fiction novel, humanity is 150 years away from Earth, aboard an enormous generation ship headed towards a distant planet. Inside, though, life continues on much as it always has. The mega-rich live in luxury, the middle class does the best it can, and indentured workers serve out contracts, their lives sold away generations ago for passage. Mira is a contract worker, owned by the rich and powerful Carlyles. She dreams of the day in 50 years when she will be free. But freedom comes sooner than anticipated when the Carlyles take their own lives. In her care, they leave their infant daughter and a shocking, unbearable secret. Now Mira is on the run, evading authorities who believe her a thief and murderer, let loose in the only world she's ever known, a world now on the brink of complete destruction. The World Gives Way is thrilling and thought-provoking sci-fi, available June 1st from Red Hook. And Marissa, welcome to Fictitious.
Hello. It's nice to meet you.
We were talking before the interview officially got started about how much we could give away of this novel, because the descriptions online play pretty coy with some of the things I mentioned right there at the top. This is not a spoiler show, but I think that the people who listen to this show are science fiction and fantasy fans. They understand terms, generally speaking, like generation ship. They understand some of the, or at least have encountered them somewhere in their reading. And I think that those are important contextual things to understand about a story like this, because it's really, really important to the plot. It's not just a throwaway, they're on a big ship. They're on a ship the size of Switzerland, and it has entire cities inside of it, and for most of the people living inside, it is their entire context. There is, in fact, a line that I love early on in it that just says, the world is a relative concept. And that really rang with me for a lot of different reasons. But it's something that I think kind of plays out thematically in this story a lot, too. As we get started talking about this, how do you describe this novel to people? What is your elevator pitch for The World Gives Way?
I don't play as coy as my publisher probably very wisely and savvily is doing. I mentioned the fact that for me, this is an apocalypse story. It's set in a world a little left of center of our own world that is a generation ship, and that it's really about what people would do if they found out that an apocalypse is coming, sort of less of a story of, like Armageddon style. We're not even going to like really think about life or our existential, understanding of what this would mean. And instead we're just going to race and fix the asteroid or whatever, but more just, having to see things break down in that way and having to learn how to live. And in some cases, like with my main character, Mira, how to really learn how to live for the very first time with knowledge like that. Also, though, I enjoy a good story, so I like to also mention that it's kind of a fun cat and mouse thing as well, because she has obstacles along the way. She wants to really kind of learn how to live with the time that she has left, but also, unfortunately, there's people out there that that are throwing obstacles in the way of that. She's, being chased by the authorities, and so she has to kind of evade people. And she's a really clever character who's really good at lying, really good at conning, things like that. And so I kind of wanted to, like, people tell you a lot that you should try and write the type of book that you always enjoyed reading. And that was sort of what I was trying to do with this, was think about bigger things, like what it means to live, what it would mean to, kind of learn how to live on the fly, but also chases and things like that, and people on the run and people getting into fights. So hopefully it ends up being a little bit of everything in that regard.
It certainly does defy a bit of genre limitations and expectations. Because I think that in trying to figure out where to drop this book into like a sub niche or a subgenre gets difficult, because in one level, it feels like you could describe this as dystopian fiction. Traditionally, we think of dystopian as kind of earthbound and often in the realm of YA, and this is neither of those things. When we think generation ship, that lends itself towards space opera or more like hard sci-fi, occasionally maybe even that kind of horror sci-fi that deals with like a sort of claustrophobia, being trapped in a space. I think there's a film that came out not too long ago called Passengers that kind of plays a little bit with that idea.
Yeah.
And again, this is not that, because claustrophobia is not something really that this group of people experience in this way. And there's a part where Mira is thinking about this change in existence that happens to her, and she's kind of thinking about how her favorite thing to do is to go to the market, which is 5 blocks away from basically the home that she lives in, serving these people named the Carlyles. And thinking about being in a ship and being 5 blocks away, that's big. When there's a description in here that kind of lays out the fact that the Generation ship is roughly the size of Switzerland. That's really big. So there's a lot of play inside of here. There are different cities, there are different places, there is a lot of different environment inside here. So it very much defies your typical idea of a Generation ship. But it also has, like you said, cat and mouse, criminal investigation kinds of things. There's a little bit of a slow burn human connection story happening in this, that's tying together. There are a lot of different things happening. So, I mean, one, when you were taking this to an agent, you're taking this to a publisher, how did you talk about that? How do you talk about where this is going to fit as far as, because marketers get real concerned about niches and subgenres. Readers maybe less so, although some are pretty tied to specific ones. So like, how are you approaching that when talking about this novel?
First off, I, as a reader, tend to gravitate towards things that define niches a little bit. Like, I mean, one of the big books that I know has been a huge influence for me, and probably, I don't know, half the writing community with stuff like this, was Station 11, which felt very much like a book that, it's post-apocalyptic, but is it? They're talking about Shakespeare a lot. There's there's all these random characters that are sort of just coming together and falling apart again, or so many things that sort of hit a number of niches at once. Ted Chiang comes to mind. Carmen Maria Machado comes to mind. Ishiguro sometimes. And I like the harder sci-fi stuff as well, but I also I kind of read a little bit of everything. I read experimental fiction. I read literary fiction. I read horror. I read, like my constant refrain. I work in a independent bookstore as well. And people will ask me, sometimes they'll come up to me and they'll be like, well, so what kinds of books do you like? And I'm like, I don't know, good ones. Anything that's well written. To me, to limit yourself in that way kind of can limit you creatively. And so it is kind of a genre bending book. Well, first off, when I got my agent, I got really lucky. I was in the last bit of my MFA program, and she was just doing sort of random rote interviews that you could sort of sign up for, give your 10 pages, have the agent look it over, and then tell you, generally how those go is they tell you what they didn't like. And my agent, Sarah Bedingfield, who's amazing, was stationed in a classroom where I had literally the day before taken a novel workshop where it was like my turn to be up with my book. And so we'd spent the entire day outlining my book. And in doing so, we'd mapped it. We'd done like this very detailed plot map on 2 giant blackboards, and it was still sitting there. And I came in to do my, 10 minutes with an agent where they tell me, what I can work on. And she's looking at me and she's like, that's your book. And she just pointed at the blackboard. And so we got to have a pretty in-depth conversation about it from the get-go. And my agent was the type of person that really liked melding genres a little bit, having things that were, horror or fantasy or sci-fi, things that, can often be considered, by the very fuddy-duddy literary types to be, too plotty or too this or too that, but then, have a realization that these things can be really thought-provoking and interesting and well thought out in a way that some people would, naturally poo-poo. And then I also think that I got really lucky with Red Hook, because I think that's something that Red Hook, which is a subsidiary of Orbit, Red Hook does a really good job finding books like that, are definitely genre, my book has a spaceship in it. It's a very large spaceship, but it is a spaceship, and there is a dystopia and there is an apocalypse, but they tend to be the books that have like multiple things on their mind at once, you know, and they can be fun, they can be thought-provoking, they can be a number of things, but like they're not necessarily trying to fit into a rabbit hole of any one particular source. And I actually, at one point when I was still in MFA, I was teaching science fiction and speculative fiction and fantasy. I was teaching like a whole genre class. And I remember like one of the big watchword quotes that we just constantly had up, and it was like first bullet point on the syllabus, was from Ursula K. Le Guin. And I don't know the quote verbatim, but it was something like, "Don't try and pigeonhole me. I have tentacles growing everywhere. I'm a poet. I'm a this. I'm a that. I have tentacles coming out of all genres." And it like, and I think like many, that Ursula K. Le Guin is a goddess. And that idea of somebody being like, well, you have to be this one thing, and that has to be the only thing that you can write, never really sat well with me, because I want to write books that are the types of books that I like to read. And I like to read a little bit of everything. I do think that my editor, my wonderful editor, Angeline Rodriguez, she did a really good job helping me to make sure that that process of me wanting to do so many things genre-wise with a single book, that it didn't end up feeling muddy or thematically weird. You know, sometimes if you, especially like in a first draft version of something like that, it can just feel like it's too many things, and then you don't quite know what mood to set down in or what to expect. It is kind of a tightrope to do something like that, because there are certain expectations that readers will have based in different genres. And so you have to make sure that you're not doing something that ultimately leaves a reader feeling cheated, but hopefully instead you're just doing something that leaves a reader pleasantly surprised.
I like that you mentioned the, being a reader of a lot of different things, because I think if there's something that's come up on the show a number of times, and it's partially because I am a reader like you. I read a lot of different things, and I can barely stand reading the same kind of novel back to back. If I read an epic fantasy, I don't want to read another epic fantasy. I want something completely to the left of it whenever I finish a story like that. And I think a lot of writers are like that, but it seems like there's a lot of readers who are really glued to certain subgenres, or, if they're a fantasy reader, they want 900-page fantasy novels, and they want them back to back to back over and over again. And I kind of read like that when I was a teenager to a degree, but I just can't fathom doing it now. So I just know it's a different strokes for different folks kind of situation as far as that thing goes. But I think that the most interesting stories that I come across are the ones that take these separate kinds of concepts and jam them together in interesting ways. It can be a marketing nightmare sometimes, I think, but it's the stories I want and that I want to read. And I'm glad that you mentioned that about Red Hook as well, because it has been my experience with this publisher, and also with just Orbit in general, that they pick interesting stories, interesting authors, and Red Hook has kind of a nice track record of taking novels that maybe skew just a little bit off to the side of the beaten path of their genre, but let authors really explore something new, and also let them explore stories that don't go where some of the mainstream publishers will push things. I think sometimes there's kind of a necessity towards leading towards the, let's make sequels, or let's make the audience pleasing ending that seems to happen, kind of, the sort of Hollywood, ending. And I don't think that's necessarily the case with Red Hook books. And I appreciate that.
I very much do as well. I can recall just in the process of, shopping the book around to different editors and different publishers and looking at marketing, I feel like most folks were pretty great, and they kind of were picking up what I was laying down. But I do remember that there was at least a couple folks from a couple publishers, like some bigger, some smaller, that they were talking to me just sort of in an initial interview way, like, let's feel each other out, get to know each other, see if we'd be a good fit for you and you'd be a good fit for us. Who, as they were talking about the book, they would sort of say, without any spoilers, I will say this, this book is great. We really love it. And we love the character. We love the this, we love the that. How would you feel about changing the entire last third of the book? Or how would you feel about changing this one character and making them like a completely different person? And it was usually something towards the tune of less Station 11, more Armageddon. It was kind of the way that it was going. And I mean, all respect to Michael Bay, because that's a really fun movie, but that's not necessarily what I was going for.
I do think that there's and I completely understand this impulse, but there is an eye for adaptability these days too.
Yeah.
Trying to think about like, well, what will get this picked up. Claire Holroyd was on the show not too long ago talking about her novel The Effort, and she ran into a similar kind of situation where like early on she got a lot of like when the book was accepted and was going to early publishing, there were some fairly big name directors and producers that were interested in the novel, and then when they kind of got a greater wind of like what that story was, that one, it was not going to fit neatly into a film. If you adapted it, it would have to be a series, and then beyond that, it wasn't like this action adventure, Armageddon-esque kinds of story. It was far more human drama and a look at what happens to the world when it falls apart. And she was like, yeah, so they kind of walked away from it. And she's like, it's probably fine for the better because it didn't force her to change her novel, but certainly. You hate leaving money on the table, and you hope that maybe those things could come along at some point too. Let's be honest. I mean, most authorship is not a gateway towards like 7-figure incomes. Like you gotta, really hit those.
I can't complain. Like I have a nice life. We're stable financially. I have other jobs besides writing books, but yeah, I've had like a couple relatives at various points be like, oh, well, now that you're a big author and you can just cash in. And I was like, cash in? What are you talking about?
There's funny ideas of that. I think in general, the weird thing about the creative arts, depending on, and I think it crosses a lot of different types of art, is that sense of like once you are in a store, once you were on the radio, once you've shown up on TV, you've made it, and now you're a billionaire. And I worked in radio for 11 years, and I worked in rock radio. So I worked with all these touring bands, people that like you were hearing on the radio all over the place. You'd hear them in commercials. Like they were very notable. And talking to these guys, they typically made about 14 grand a year. They were making like minimum wage dollars, and they had 5 shirts to their name that they wore every other day, like on the road, and were grateful for a shower. And yet everybody was like, oh wow, you got a record contract and you're like so fancy and rich now. And they're like, a record contract is like being an indentured servant. You are on the hook to the record company for like 2 records or so where they own your life. And yeah, people just don't kind of understand that. They just have that sense of like, well, your book is in a bookstore. So now you're baller, right? Like that's the big time.
Exactly.
They don't know what Midwest
whenever I think
is
of record
stuff,
executives, I kind of picture Mr. Burns sitting here like this behind a desk. I'm like, yeah, they're definitely enslaving people in some form.
Absolutely.
2 contracts.
Yeah. Which, I mean, thematically ties in. Nice segue, right? Like almost into
excellent
the
segue.
stuff.
That was masterfully done.
I pride myself on a good segue. But like thematically, yeah, you do have these contracted workers. You have these people who are on this ship this way. And normally I talk about theme a little earlier. I'm going to switch around to kind of world building here so that we can kind of dive into what this means, because I think that will open up some discussion of themes in this novel, because you've got some really heady stuff. There's a lot to chew on in this book. But let's talk about this generation ship. Let's talk about what this thing is, and then what that social structure is inside of it. So the novel pretty early on tells us what this thing is, although there's more revelations to come as time goes along. But can you kind of walk us through what the ship is, what life is like inside of it, and then we can kind of drill down into the social structure internally?
So the book is set on a generation ship. And like you mentioned, the ship is very large. It's about the size of Switzerland. It's huge. And so the people inside of it can basically live a life that is very, very similar to what we have going on just in our day-to-day lives. There are trees, there are animals, there are seas and mountains and cities and commutes and trains and all of that normal stuff, which was a very convenient thing for me so that I could world build, but just enough. Because what I was mostly interested in writing was our world, but a little left of center, like what a world would be, say, if it was designed. So I never really get into it in the book, what happened in the old world, what happened back on Earth that sent everybody out, because that's not really what I wanted to focus on in the story. But one of the things that does get discussed is that this is a very designed world, and people bought into it. there was a large number of people that were coming onto this ship, but you had to buy your ticket on, and this was really the only way to leave. And so what you end up having is this hierarchical society that starts with the richest people you can possibly imagine, because those are the only people that can get tickets onto this thing. And this all was stuff that sort of came out of just sort of me logically thinking about it over a period of time. Is I sort of think that this is, knock on wood, hopefully we won't ever need to do this, but if we were to ever have a generation ship, it would probably be privatized. And it would probably be something where at least a portion of it is things that you could buy into. But then that does pose a problem, I logically think about, which is that you need a serving class. You always need a serving class. And that's why, like, in this country, like, there's still a huge amount of illegal immigration and horrible class divide. And so I don't think that would suddenly get erased or go away just because you had a bunch of uber rich people all on a ship together. They would still need somebody to, work in a factory. They would still need somebody to be the picker at a farm. They'd still need somebody to be their housekeeper, their nanny, their this, their that. And so what I came up with was this idea that I could really feasibly see happening, which is that you'd end up with this sort of indentured servant class, but there would be sort of a catch to it, which is if you can't afford a ticket onto this generation ship, you can sign a contract and be a worker there. And then this ship, like a lot of generation ships, it's going to be en route to this new planet, which I've named Telos, for roughly, I think it was about 200 years. So within that, you're going to die, and you will never, you will die under contract is the way that I call it, so that you continue to be part of the labor force. But the deal is that contract continues down to your offspring, and it will continue down to your grandchildren. And then one day your descendants will be able to be free once we reach Telos. And so you can be assured that your legacy and your family will live on, and you won't get to be free, but your great-grandchildren will. That sort of sounded like something that I could see somebody rationalizing in a government. And that way it's a choice. It's not slavery. It's a choice. And we'll have a workers' rights alliance to make sure everything's very fair and that everybody's being treated okay. And they all get a day off, and all this sort of stuff. But you basically end up with an indentured servant class. And then you end up with all these other problems that would come with stuff like that, where, maybe the first generation is completely fine with their decisions, but the second generation of this indentured servant class would then feel rightfully pretty cheated and enslaved because their father or mother signed them into this, and they're not going to see freedom. It's going to be their kids or their kids' kids or their kids' kids' kids, And so then you have problems with possible rebellions, possible suicides. There's all sorts of things that can go wrong. And the main character of The World Gives Way is part of the generation that theoretically will see freedom. I start the book when they're about 50 years away from getting to Telos, this home planet. Mira's in her early 20s, so she's looking ahead and she's thinking to herself, super, so I'm going to be about 70 when I touch down on a planet, and then I get to be free for 10, 20 years, and then I die. And so she's already kind of trying to craft her way out of servitude in other ways. There's over time, over generations, I've also sort of put into the world that there are certain loopholes. You can, if you can find a nice guy to seduce or a nice young lady to seduce, you might be able to marry your way out of servitude. It's very difficult to do, but there's ways in which you can try and sort of con your way out of it. So she's, at the start of the book, she's working on that within this world. And she lives in the biggest city within this generation ship world, which is called New London. The generation ship, because it is, about the size of Switzerland, has a couple different towns and cities and geographical things going on in it. There's a sea, there's a mountain range, there's a desert, there's all sorts of stuff.
It's quite expansive, and that gives you a lot of space to play with in a cat and mouse, chase story. And also, I think there's a number of different things that you're talking about there, that gives you a sense of things happening in this world, because they literally think of this place as the world, because for everybody on it, it's their entire existence. As Mira learns more about the ship itself, she has to confront things she's never considered before. She's never thought about the hull. She's never thought about the fact there's a worker class that just works on the outside of the ship. There's a point where she sees the blueprints for it, and she's never seen that. She's never become aware of the solar sails or the shape of the ship as a giant cylinder or all those things. Like, these people live their entire world, their entire lives inside of this space, and it's expansive enough that they kind of don't even question it. They have a sky. It's fake, but they have a sky. It's interesting that once you have second and third generation people on this ship, they don't remember Earth. They never had Earth. So their context is just the ship. And so when people talk about like, oh, we got to preserve the ways of the place that we came from, they're like, sure, okay, fine. We were never from there. They're not Earthlings anymore, right? Like, they're just humans. Thematically, did you know kind of what you wanted to say going in? Did you have the idea first for like, this is the world, and then you figured out what it was going to say? How did you approach that? How did that evolve on the page?
I started with apocalypse stuff. That was kind of like the starting point. I think I'd been toying with the idea for a while of just how it would feel to be a person in that situation, whatever the outcome is, but just to be faced with somebody telling you incontrovertibly, the world is going to end, and it's almost easier to have a doctor. It's almost easier to imagine to have a doctor tell you, go into a doctor's office and he's like, you have cancer, you're going to die, because it's just you. But to think of like everything, going away, that was something that I was thinking about a lot. I even wrote a couple short stories about it at one point, just in a much like sort of smaller way. And then I think like a lot of the other stuff sort of came out of that. I find that if you're interested in a particular thing, and you start creating a character and you really think about it with all the specificity that something like that requires, if you're really trying to do it justice, a whole slew of other stuff will just sort of start to come out. I'm pretty sure I had no thoughts about class divides when I started writing the book. And then the book became so much about class divides, but it was like the most logical thing, because as I was writing it, I think I started with an apocalypse, and then I knew that I wanted to write a world that was familiar but a little left of center. I wanted to be able to get designy about it and kind of find ways to mash up all the things that I find most beautiful or strange or amazing about the world. And then if you just had to compact it into the size of Switzerland, what would that end up looking like? But then I had to come up with a reason as to why that would occur. And the most natural thought I had was generation ship. And I think I'd been watching a lot of space operas myself at the time. I think I'd probably seen Interstellar not that long ago. And they do something a little similar there. I mean, they only do suggestions of it, but at the same time, sort of seeing what that would be. And then, it just kind of naturally, like, one thing falls out of the other, falls out of the other, falls out of the other. I needed Mira to be the type of character that would find out the kind of information that she finds out from the Carlyles. And so even before I'd conceived of the Carlyles, I was like, so she needs to be close enough to power to find out a secret that, and this isn't a huge spoiler because I think it pretty much takes place in the first 20 pages of the book, to find out that there's a tear in the hull of this ship that she, up until this point, never really considered a ship. But everybody in the world, logically, if they sit there and think about it, they consider it a ship. But really, they're talking about it as though it's the whole world. And they take it all very much for granted. And so to have somebody that would even be thinking about the hull and would be privy to the kind of knowledge that there might be something going horribly wrong with the ship, she would have to be pretty high up in government. But I kind of found it boring to write about a politician that has it all. I think it's more common than not that people that seem incredibly powerless but happen to be adjacent to power end up knowing more or being more worldly than the people that are actually in power. And so I found that to be a much more interesting character to write. And that got me thinking about what a servant class on a ship like this would be like. And then that got me thinking about the indentured servitude possibility. And it all just sort of fell into place that way. And then the cat and mouse chase thing and the fact that she's being chased by the authorities, if we want to get down to real brass tacks, that started out purely as a way for me to find some sort of story momentum, because it's really hard to introduce a concept like, well, the world is ending and you know about it now. What are you going to do? Go. And then have a character do anything other than sit there and drink. So there was ways in which, when I was first writing the book, where it was, I couldn't help but have the book end up feeling a little meandering at times. And I wanted something to be driving her. And it also seemed incredibly natural, the more that I thought about it, that if you are a person in an indentured servitude class and your bosses both mysteriously commit suicide and then you peace out with their baby because you don't want to be living that life anymore if the world's ending, you're not going to stick around to dust more stuff and cook more meals. That the authorities, what the sort of generationship equivalent of the FBI is that kind of shows up, they're going to at least be thinking that you, quote unquote, broke contract, which is a crime in this world. If you're an indentured servant, if you're a contract worker and you suddenly decide to stop being a contract worker, that's not really allowed, and they'll bring you in. The book starts with sort of a dual point of view that way, and you end up with two characters and a reason for Mira to be running and for her to keep going the way that she is, and for her to be striving for some things. That was just in the world of creating a story and really like putting together the building blocks of how that was going to work and be something that people would be interested in continuing to read past the first 20 pages. That seemed like a really ripe opportunity. And then it gave me Tobias, who is the second sort of main character in the book. And so I ended up getting to have a dual point of view narrative, which I always think is very fun. And then I got to have a character that, for all intents and purposes, when it comes to the secret of the ship and the fact that the hull is torn up and that the world is breaking down, you have one character who knows everything and then another character who just knows absolutely nothing. And then also, just by virtue of who they are as people, Mira spends a lot of time actually having a complex, thinking that she's not smart enough. And then Tobias thinks that he knows everything. And it turns out that that is actually the exact opposite. And then the book ends up being a chase, where they're trying to track her down for reasons that they think are much more mundane, that it's just a contract worker who has broken contract and possibly kidnapped a baby. And maybe she killed the Carlyles, but they're not entirely sure because they do look like suicides. But whatever it is, it needs an explanation. And then all Mira's trying to do is keep her head above water enough to figure out how she should feel about all of this crazy apocalypse stuff, but also she needs to stay free just to be able to have the freedom to figure that stuff out. And also, if this whole apocalypse thing is really going to go down the way she thinks it's going to go down, then she'd really like to live whatever life she can, and she would prefer to not do that in servitude or in a jail cell. So it created a lot of good momentum and a lot of reasons for there just to be characters who properly bounce off of each other. I think that it's really important, again, sort of craft-wise, to have characters interact and fight and bond and talk and do all those things, because that tends to be the best way for you to figure out who your characters are in the end. There's so much more that is revealed from how a character reacts to another character, whether that's an antagonist or a friend or this or that, than is revealed in you just saying at the start of introductory chapter, like, well, Tobias was a very neat and well put together person and blah, 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 blah. It's like, well, that sounds lovely and it sort of sounds like a children's book, but also like, what's he going to do? If you put him in a certain situation against different types of people, what's he going to do? And that's really ultimately how you understand who characters are. And I don't know about other people, but I never fully know what my characters are going to be at the start of something. I usually, about 3/4 of the way through the book, I realize that I had some things completely wrong about them. And then I'll have to go back and kind of course correct and this and that, because I've decided that there was something hidden, some hidden depths there that I didn't really know about before.
The characters are tricky like that. They like to, in the 11th hour, show up and be like, "Oh, you had this wrong. You need to reconsider this." And you're like, "Damn it! Why didn't you tell me that earlier?" I do like there's something you said in there that kind of I think it's worth noting from a constructive standpoint, that one of a great form of tension in stories is a gap in knowledge between characters, as long as it makes sense. If there's a property that can get poked at in media where it doesn't work, it's like Lost, where all the characters have artificial breaks between them, where like nobody ever tells anybody anything, and so people walk into
oh my god, all of the cryptic vague phrases that show would say. My version of that I would always joke about is like, there's a difference between, like, when it comes to withholding information, there's a difference between a legitimate great twist in a movie and a Shyamalan twist, where like things are just forcibly held back because you want to have a crazy reveal later, or people are deliberately vague for no apparent reason. But Lost is the perfect example.
Right, yeah. And that's the thing I can't tolerate, when it's like, when people keep something for no reason, when everything they would always benefit from just saying the truth and instead keep it because the narrative needs it for tension. It always feels so forced. But in a situation like this, when you're holding the fact that the ship has a crack, that it will come apart, that everything will be destroyed, that is really big and powerful information, but it's not just something you can just drop on anybody, whether they won't believe what you're saying or because it will cause chaos, absolute panic and chaos for people to know this, which we know is the people who do know about it already at the beginning of the story are cracking under that pressure. That was punny, but still, falling apart under the pressure of that knowledge. You were mentioning the POVs, the fact you have 2 different alternating POVs. There's actually like 3 POVs in here, because I mean, you have the 2 third-person limited with Tobias and Mira, but there are also chapters where it is like an omniscient third person that fills you in a little bit of the background. I love this mechanic. This is one of my favorite things in fiction, where if you have like the POV characters, and then you step aside just once in a while for an external thing that gives you a different viewpoint, a little bit more information, in a way that is detached from the character drama, but typically kind of reveals a different kind of narrative voice. I'm really curious for you in setting this up. Was that something that you had in there all along? Did you add it in later? What was the editorial feedback on doing that additional third person? What did that look like in the writing process?
It was in there fairly early on, though not from the very beginning. When I was first workshopping just the first few pages of the book, or first few chapters, we'll say, I was finding that people were sort of reading the book with the wrong expectations. In fact, I think the thing that it made me think of the most was something like 2012 or Armageddon or something like that. Like, it felt like they were watching a Roland Emmerich movie, but they were reading it in a book, and they're like, great, so now they're going to take charge and they're going to run and they're going to go find, the asteroid or the this or the that. And I was like, no, this is a real big thing, and it's a heavy duty apocalypse that's not really going to be fixed by like one plucky person, finding the right scientist and go. I was having a terrible time finding a way to guide audience expectation with Mira's point of view alone, or with Mira and Tobias's point of view alone. But I guess in this case, it's mostly Mira, because Mira's really the only one at the start that knows that there's an apocalypse on the line. I couldn't find a way to fix that just with Mira's point of view, because the point of view that I had, which I really loved using, was third person, but very close third person. So you're hearing Mira's thoughts. You really don't see anything outside of Mira's perspective. It's the opposite of omniscient. It's not, we're not supposed to know anything that Mira doesn't know, and Mira can't know the outcome or how bad the whole break really is. She's only just trying to figure out how to read blueprints, and she's only hearing what the Carlyles are telling her just before they kill themselves. So there's a lot of plausible deniability that a reader can have. And some of that is good because you don't want to fully know every single thing that's going to happen over the course of the book. You want to be able to really, see how everything unfolds. But I wanted people to take the apocalypse a little bit more seriously than they were taking that at the start. They're like, so yeah, and then they're going to find a ray gun and they're going to go and they're going to fix it. And I was like, no, they're not. Whatever ends up happening, this doesn't seem to be the tone that I want. And so I remember cracking it and figuring out that what I really needed was some sort of in between, every once in a while, omniscient narrator to come in. When I was on a plane flight to Mexico to visit some family, and I brought along Invisible Cities, which is one of my favorite, very non-sci-fi books, but it's kind of experimental. It's by Calvino, and it's this really incredible book that is almost entirely plotless. And it's basically, the setup of it is Marco Polo is talking to Kublai Khan, and he's talking about these different cities that he has seen within Kublai Khan's empire. They're all sort of made up, and you get this sense that they're all just being brought out from Marco Polo's head, and they're all sort of wrapped in with memory and philosophy and experience of life. And it's the most beautiful and easy, plotless, experimental book that I've ever read, and I highly recommend it. It's one of my favorites. And all of these cities that Marco Polo would describe would be their own vignettes. It would have a heading to each one. It would say cities in memory, or cities in space, or cities in time. And it would then describe this completely made up city. And by the end, you wouldn't really be describing a city at all, but you would be describing some concept of the human psyche or life, or what it is to experience time, or experience love, or experience this. And he found this very beautiful, poetic way to do it. And I thought that would be a really nice way for me to sort of sneakily world build, but also keep up the general thoughtful tone that I was hoping to give to the book. And then also have a very omniscient narrator tell the reader very bluntly, like, listen, there's a hull in this ship, and this hull has a great big tear in it, and this is what's going to happen. And no ifs, ands, or buts about it, because I am an omniscient narrator and I know everything. And I'm going to also explain to you how certain things were built, or how certain things were, designed or put together, and ultimately have this kind of mean something a little more, because we're also going to be describing humanity, or we're going to be describing the way in which people interact, this or that. And I organized it based on city, so that it doesn't happen very often, but pretty much every time Mira or Tobias come to a new city within this giant generation ship, there will be a quick interstitial chapter from an omniscient narrator that will tell you overtly about this city, but then in doing so will also tell you a little bit more about this apocalypse, and will tell you a little bit more about the way everything was built. And then that way it was great, because I could get in all this information that I think was somewhat important just to be good table setting for anybody reading, but also it wouldn't have to be this ham-fisted thing where I'd have to try and find some way to insert Mira learning about it when she doesn't really know much of anything, because she's just this lower level person in this world where nobody really thinks about how this generation ship was made, or how it's going to come apart, or anything in between. And so it was incredibly fun. It was one of my favorite things in the book to write, were those interstitial chapters, but also it was incredibly useful just in terms of finding a way to get some exposition in that wasn't really going to find a way in any other way.
Then thinking about trying to weave all of that together, because you do have several different types of stories kind of happening at once here. You have big existential things to consider. You have multiple POVs. How did you write this? I mean, did you pants your way through this? Did you outline it? Some combination of the two? You talked about your characters kind of changing their idea of who they were as time went along as well. So I'm just curious, like purely from a craft standpoint, how did you construct this novel?
I'm very much an outliner, but also I don't try and be too rigorous about it. Basically, I always have an outline, but I also am aware that my outline is likely going to go in the garbage and get changed. on the fly, like as things sort of come up. I started out with a background in playwriting and some screenwriting. And so I have a lot of outlining just sort of in my core from that, because that's a lot of the basis for more script writing. Prose writing has always been a little bit more loosey-goosey than that. And so I definitely outline heavily. And I think generally speaking, whenever I've written something long form, I always tend to know how it starts and how it's going to end. And I need an outline just for the sake of me being able to know how the hell I'm going to get around the middle, because to make sure that the characters, end up where I want them to end up, but I'm not forcing them there like a little godlike author with chess pieces or something, because you can always tell when authors are doing that. And the characters aren't just like letting themselves go where they want to go. For that, I need outlines, but highly fluid, highly flexible. If suddenly it seems not genuine that Mira would want to be doing this, or that Tobias would be doing this, then absolutely the outline must change, because the characters do surprise you. And if they don't, that's probably a bad sign. If you're so slavish to an outline that your characters don't surprise you ever at any point in the book, that probably means that you're playing God with them, and they're not going to really be as alive and relatable and empathetic and complex as you want them to be. So yeah, I'd say, long and short of it is a little both.
And then like you just said there, you've got some screenwriting background, some playwriting background. You've also been a teacher, and you've taught fiction and genre. Thinking about all that stuff and its influence on your writing, do you have kind of a plotting system or anything that you adhere to? It seems like screenwriters often, kind of maybe more often than prose writers, have some type of, whether it's just the traditional 3 or the 4-act structure or 7-point system or save the cat or story circle, or gosh, there's so many of them at this point. Lots of different options, things that can be used, things that can be thrown away. But is there any of those in your particular arsenal?
I definitely really enjoy a good old-fashioned hero's journey, a story circle. I've never read Save the Cat. I've heard good and bad things about Save the Cat. I think this is one of the good things about reading a lot of different types of stuff, is I really enjoy mapping plots out whenever I see a new movie or read a book or anything like that. I really enjoy sort of thinking afterwards about what is the inciting incident, what happened here, because more often than not, everything will fit into at least like a very, very vaguely basic version of a plot, rising action, catastrophe or climax, and then, coming back down. But from there, things get really strange. And so I guess when it comes to my own writing, I would say I follow pretty linear plots more often than not. I've never tried to do anything where I'm jumping around too much or meandering too much, but I try not to think about it while I'm writing it. Instead, I try to just have a lot of knowledge already stored up about types of plots and the types of plots that I like. But again, it's one of those things where if I sit down to write a new novel and I'm like, great, so this one, it's going to be a 5-act structure, and the denouement is going to come here, and this is going to come here, and bloggity, bloggity, blah. Like, it's not going to feel very genuine. And so instead, I just absorb as much as I can and hope that it kind of comes back out via instinct. When I finished this book, I was shocked to learn that I'd written something with a 5-act structure. It ended up having a 5-act structure, and I did not realize it until we were into copy editing. And then I was actually properly distanced from my book enough to read it through as I was meant to do, because I was, going through copy editing marks, and I was like, oh, holy shit, like that's a 5-act structure. And I don't think I would have ever attempted to write a 5-act structure, because that can be complicated and weird. But it's what was needed for this particular story, so it worked. But like, I've read some of the books that I've read that I've liked the most when it came to sort of plot structure, things like that, is when it comes to screenwriting, I really like John Truby's book, The Anatomy of Story. he attacks plot from a lot of different angles. He doesn't necessarily, he tries to not be as prescriptive. So he doesn't necessarily sit there and go like, okay, so at this exact moment, you need to save the cat or do whatever you need to do. And then this will happen here. And then this will happen here. I mean, he's a screenwriter. So there's always a little bit of a sort of prescriptive nature to those things. They tend to box things in that I don't necessarily always agree need to be boxed in. But he at least likes to talk about different types of story structure, how if you look at experimental films, or God help us, if you look outside the Western canon for once, how things will suddenly change very much when it comes to story momentum, how characters are driven, if they're driven at all, things like that. One of my other favorite books when it comes to plot structures, just because, again, it's really non-prescriptive, is this book called Meander, Spiral, Explode by Jane Allison. And it's talking about, and John Truby actually does a little bit of this too in Anatomy of Story. It talks about how some plots are very linear, and you've got your standard Freytag's pyramid of, there we go up and then we go down and then, we're good to go. And some of them are your standard hero's journey, Joseph Campbell, here we go in a circle to the underworld and then we come back up. But then some of them can be more experimental, or they can be not so experimental. They might not feel experimental, but maybe in certain ways they are, where instead of the plot following, a dot from point A to point B to point C, it's a scatter plot. And you're seeing lots of different characters that are all seeing things from a different point of view at different times, but somehow it still coalesces. Or a spiral where maybe you start at a point where everything is very tightly woven together and you really have no information. And then things start to sort of suddenly spiral out further and further and further. And as it goes further out, the world gets bigger, or things get more chaotic, or more information is allowed to you as a reader. Explode is obvious in the way where, again, it starts with something very, very tight, and then it goes to a million different places that you wouldn't expect. And maybe it does it all at the same time rather than being something quite so linear. And all these different techniques she talks about, and she talks about different books that might use this. And meander is another one where when she talks about meander, it solely means, if I remember right, a book where the story really isn't driven by plot at all. It's more driven by characters or connection or experience or feeling, which is a very experimental thing to do. Definitely not what my book does, but I like reading books like that. And I like reading about all these possible story structures, even if I don't use them, because then when I find the one that I'm using, chances are it's being used for the right reason and not just because that's the only one I know. And then it offers, in my opinion, a richness to whatever I'm doing, even if I am doing a much more traditional story structure, which I'd say with this book, it's a pretty traditionally linear story structure, though it is, as it turns out, in 5 acts.
And then before we wrap up, just the pure nuts and bolts, what do you write in? What's your software? Do you do anything analog? What are your tools of the trade?
I've got a nice little drawing table that I got set up over there, and I tend to sketch out outlines. I'm also a visual artist, so I tend to be fairly visual in the way that I kind of put things up and around. And so I'll have sort of a large piece of paper of sorts that I then, throw up a basic outline in pencil. And then I'll kind of have different little side boxes of, well, here's character A, here's character B, here's character C. And then just different little notes, so-and-so should do this at some point. And I definitely think this needs to be a moment at some point. And so-and-so and so-and-so will definitely fight, things like that. But then when it comes to actually writing things down, I wish I was cool enough to be one of those people that writes on yellow legal pads and all that nonsense, but I really I immediately just go and type it out on a laptop. For this book and for the book that I'm currently writing, I've been using Google Docs because then I don't have to remember to save things. It just saves it on its own. That's my main tools of the trade.
Well, like I said at the top, The World Gives Way arrives on June 1st. This episode, I think, will come out just a day or so ahead of that, so it should be right on time with the release. where should people be following you? This is you said you're working on your next novel. This is your debut novel. It's always so weird sometimes because you can tell people have been writing for a long time, have released things in a lot of different places, but your debut, you're a debutante in the the fiction world with the book release. Where should people be following you online? Where are you at? Website, Twitter, newsletter, any of those things?
Well, wonderfully so. I have an internet magic name in that nobody else has my name on the internet, so I don't have to use like weird numbers or extra qualifiers of any sort. So it is marissalevien.com for my website, at Marissa Levien on Twitter, at Marissa Levien on not on Facebook, yeah. At Marissa Levien on Instagram. And those are my main places that I'm at. I have a Facebook account that's years old and completely untouched, so that's not really worth anybody's time. But Instagram and Twitter, I'm on a lot.
Yeah, nobody should go to Facebook anyway. I mean, I post every new episode.
I feel bad
there,
enough about Instagram because they're owned by Facebook, but I'm a visual artist and I like doing visual things, so I still kind of got to be there. But
yeah, I wear that same thing all the time because I kind of hate Instagram. I mean, I'm a graphic designer, so the visual side of it appeals to me, but the platform just doesn't. And I absolutely despise the stories or whatever, those like quick, things that go away really fast.
Oh,
whatever.
Yeah.
There's something really frantic about the nature of that causes my ADHD to flare up in a big way, and I get anxious. I literally get anxious looking at them, so I do not like them. But like now more and more people are like, you should just go look at the TikTok. And I'm like, but I'm old. Do I have to go to TikTok?
No, I don't want to. I honestly, like, TikTok looks like a perfectly lovely thing that I'm happy for people to show me weird little 5-second videos of like people dancing and pandas and stuff. But I'm like, there's never going to be a point where I want to be a person creating that content. I bless you and your ability to do it, but I'm going to just stick with the ones that I know.
Oh, I feel that in a very big way.
Maybe be famous enough to not do any of it.
You'd hope. Just to eject social media into the sun sometimes feels like the best way to go. Well, I can't believe I didn't do this at any point in here. Here's the book, The World Gives Way. Beautiful cover coming out from Red Hook. This is exciting, thought-provoking, interestingly constructed and very well written science fiction. I hope people go and check this out. If this is not part of their usual diet of genre bending sci-fi, I think that this is a good gateway for them to get into it. There's a lot to chew on here, and I was excited to have this book end up in my hands, and I hope people go and check it out. And Marissa, thank you so much for joining me on Fictitious.
Thank you. This has been so fun.